Every family has room to grow as they journey through life together, and that's why we've created this podcast, Room to Grow. In each episode, from our little room to yours, our conversations will take us to places where families can grow together. Sometimes those spaces can feel uncomfortable, but they're places where we can find wisdom to weave into the fabric of our families. If you long to cultivate a deeper connection with your kids as you help them thrive in Jesus, you're in the right place. With lots of love, hope, laughter, and grace, we invite you to make room to grow with us. All right, everyone, welcome back. Hi, Mike Black. Glad you're here again today to talk about teen resiliency. Again, I'm Sydel McKim, Family Ministry Director here at CTK Bellingham. And Mike, I got to intro you last episode. You have a wealth of experiences and wisdom as a school counselor, a therapist, a professor. You speak here at Christ the King, and you have a family of your own. We both do, with kids all over the map that we adore, and also have learned a lot. It's not a cakewalk. We have not arrived, but we are still learning and excited. And so today's episode, we're going to be talking about teen resiliency. One thing I do want to highlight about you, Mike, that I didn't in the last one is that you and your family attend Christ the King Bellingham, and you are one of our amazing drummers. So audience, feel free to watch for Mike up there on the stage some Sunday. He really rocks out, and it's inspiring.
And I tell kids that I'm a rock star without hair. So, yeah, I've actually drummed longer than I've known the Lord and my wife. I've drummed since I was about 10, and I'll just kind of confess, for lack of a better word, that I love classic rock, so so that's why I'm a rock star without hair.
Love it. I'm with you, and so respect that you love the classic rock, and just thank you for all that you do here at our church. Just grateful for your wisdom, but also your musical abilities and helping us to worship and rock out on Sundays. So, Mike, take it away.
Yeah. So a question I would like to ask parents to ponder on, that I asked a series of questions last time, is one question. Think, parents, about your kiddos and or kiddo, meaning an adolescent or pre-adolescent, whatever it might be. And what is your greatest joy raising an adolescent or preteen? And what is your greatest challenge? And again, I encourage you to think about that. If you're married, share about that with your spouse, share that with a friend, but think about your greatest joy and your greatest challenge in raising a teen. Because I'll get into this in just a moment, but one of the biggest differences between, for me, working with a teen as a therapist is that if they were rude to me, which most time they're not, I don't take it personally. But my own kiddo, I take it personally. And so I'll talk about that in just a moment. And so just think about that challenge, and which is a good segue into a little bit about my story in terms of with my son. He's 25 now, and I want to make sure that the audience knows that the last 5 years we've had a great relationship. A lot has been restored, actually pretty much everything.
Wonderful.
I will say it this way, that what I'll share with parents when I meet with them in therapy before I meet with the adolescent, what I'll share with you and the audience is that ever since my son was 12, I don't judge parents anymore. He's our oldest. And why? Because I messed up often. And my experience was this, that I was great with middle school kids all those 20 years. I felt like I was. But my dynamic of hypocrisy that I felt within myself is I was good with them, but I messed up with my son all the time. That's why I don't judge parents anymore. But here's the good news. It makes me a very compassionate, empathetic counselor to parents of adolescents. And so in that dynamic, I do want to briefly talk about this concept that I have learned over the years. Much of this comes from my training at Fuller Seminary. Family systems was what I learned. And I'm visual, and so I'd like to kind of show you this rubber band that I'm holding up here. It's called a tug-of-war. And I'll first talk very quickly in terms of how that happens in the Gottman research. That's marriage counseling that some of you might be familiar with. And then I'll quickly apply it to adolescent with parent. So in most marriages, what happens with my wife and I, with many people, is that this finger here, this thumb right here to my left, your right, is, let's say, the wife, and on the right, which is your left, is the husband. And in most research of the Gottman dynamic is that when there's a conflict, the wife pursues. She's more articulate and say more and almost be like a lawyer, not in a bad way. Whereas the husband, including myself, we are champion. I don't mean this in a good way at distancing, go the opposite way. The more she pursues, the more he distances.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
How does it apply to a tug of war with a parent with a teen? Well, here's what happened with my son and I, is that he's our oldest, our first to let go of. And for any parent, you would probably say amen to this. Letting go is easier said than done.
Amen.
Right?
Yes.
And so what would happen with my son and I is that as he would be, my mind, rebellious and very much what was his asserting his independence and testing the waters, testing the boundaries we would have, I would react in a controlling, nagging way. The more nagging I became, controlling, the more I react to things personally, the more he would react and get angry. Very simply, the rubber band would get tighter and tighter, which means more tension. Mm-hmm. Here's the problem with a tug of war, whether it's a marriage or adolescent with parent. The tighter the rubber band gets, meaning anger, tension, the more it becomes the blame game. His mindset was likely this: if my parents weren't so strict, like other parents that I know, if my parents were so controlling, I wouldn't have to be so quote unquote rebellious. Our mindset was if he wasn't so rebellious, we wouldn't have to be so controlling, and therefore nothing changes.
Tension. Mm-hmm.
And but here's the healing part of this. My son and I went on a hike about 4 years ago up in Ptarmigan Ridge, up in beautiful Mount Baker area. And I confessed to him things that I felt like I did wrong as a parent. He said to me, quote unquote, "You and mom did such a good job with raising me." I cannot tell you how restorative that was for me, speaking of resiliency, just to be able to have that dynamic. And so I give parents hope that as a kiddo's frontal lobe develops,
yes,
which for some of us hasn't happened yet, like me. Just ask my wife.
Mostly though, right?
Just ask my wife.
I will.
Okay.
I'm calling her after this.
Yeah. Is that there's hope. There's restoration and resiliency even within a family and not just an individual.
Right.
And so why do I spend time about that is just that dynamic of what it means to have tension and restoration in that process, noting that tug of war. So parents, I just encourage you to think about, what does that tug of war look like or feel like within your family, between you and your teen, or whatever that looks like? Most parents with adolescents have some sort of tug of war that happens. Mm-hmm. Not all the time, though.
Right.
Especially since the pandemic.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. Thank you. And thank you for your transparency and sharing your own story around that. And definitely the part that resonated with me the most was working with kids, working with families for so many years, feeling like I had all the tools, feeling like I was able to support. And then in my own home, feeling like just helpless.
Yes.
The tools all of a sudden weren't there. I didn't have enough and I was failing, and the guilt would just start to stack up for my husband and I. And so thank you for the hope in that too. Oh, yeah. I mean, and also that's a familiar place for kids to, act their best and their worst, so, and also for your trip with your son on the hike. What a beautiful moment to be able to go, wow, for so many years, I felt like I was just, we weren't jiving. And now all of a sudden he shared with you such a beautiful moment that.
And the quick thing I want to interject is with that struggle that you've had with your kiddos and me with mine, more past tense, thank goodness we have the Psalms that say over and over again, "Help me, Lord." Yes. Right.
Yes. I've said that. Yes. About a million times. Yes. Sometimes daily when they were little. But yes, and thank you for sharing that about your son and the hope around that, because I do think that we do need to hold on to the hope. Yes. Because the days can feel long, but we know that the years, they can go by quickly. Yep. So thanks for sharing on that. And also, if you can speak a little bit to kids and resiliency, and again, just summing up what resiliency means. Yep.
So I shared a little bit about that last time. I'll go a little bit more detail. It means 2 or 3 key things, and you could pick whichever definition fits for you as an audience and for you as well, and myself, is that informally it means to bounce back. I shared that last time. It also means to be restored, and to put a little bit more spiritually, it also means about to overcome. And the Bible is filled with stories upon stories about resiliency without using the word resiliency, Old and New Testament. Not just the crucifixion and resurrection, that's obvious, but so many stories of broken people being resilient. It's never used the word resiliency. Yet when I wrote my book, which is about resiliency, I was able to see, wow, the Bible is filled with stories about resiliency. Yes. I know I'm repeating it, but it's just, I celebrate that about bouncing back and overcoming.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'm going to go into a different hike I did with my son in terms of what you're asking about resiliency. One more recently, last August. It was just this past summer of 2022. So we went on a grueling hike. It was we ended up doing Plan B because Plan A didn't work out. I won't go into it. Ended up being 9 miles. One way was 4.5 miles, which sounds okay, but the elevation gain was almost 5,000 feet.
My goodness.
And I'm in pretty good shape, but it was grueling. And what does that mean in light of resiliency? We had an end goal, which was this beautiful cabin that was on top of a tower with a 360-degree view. But we hadn't got there yet. It was not within sight. And about halfway through the hike, 2.5, 3 miles in, I wanted to quit. I was so fatigued because of the elevation and a number of reasons. And my mind was looking back because I was struggling with fatigue so much. And by the way, fatigue goes hand in hand with the last 3 years in light of what I talked about the last episode. We don't do well when we're fatigued. And it was great. What happened is when I was ready to quit, my son was empathetic saying, I'd like to go, but it's okay if we go back, Dad. I looked up and guess what? Within a tunnel vision of what I saw up ahead of me was the cabin. And so the end result, and just a segue, but not really, is that almost all the heroes in the Bible, they all had the end in mind, which has to do with resiliency. Every one of them had the end in mind. Maybe not at first, but they did. And so this hike, I like to call it a journey of detours and destinations. And you know what, audience, and you and I, that's the way life is. It's filled with destinations and detours. They go back and forth.
So many.
And so resiliency is about keeping the end in mind despite those detours, just like I did on the hike. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't a struggle after I saw the cabin. But some of us never see the cabin, but we know it's coming up, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Because maybe God hasn't healed, or maybe I so often in my journey with my son when he was 16, I didn't see the cabin. What I mean by that, I didn't like him, but I loved him. And I needed to believe that a cabin was around the corner. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And also hits home for me too.
Yeah.
Because there are some hard days there. And it's hard to feel those realities. And I know that people listening might also, identify with that as well. Thank you. Would you share a little bit, Mike, on some examples of how resiliency played out in the Bible?
Yes. 2 of them. One of them I speak about in my book. I alluded to this in our last episode, but it's okay to repeat a bit of it, is that the Apostle Peter, who most of us are very familiar with, most of us know the story, but I'll just share it, that the weekend prior to Jesus dying, he betrayed Jesus and denied him and a number of things that was actually prophetically said about him. And a lot of us don't think about this, but he had a weekend of misery, of guilt and remorse and anger at himself over what happened. And he was so broken that he came to the end of himself. I don't mean that in terms of despair or suicide, but rather he came to the end of himself in a healthy way. And I just wonder, I ponder this with everybody that's listening, including myself, would Peter have had such an incredible change in his character after Pentecost? And if you read Acts chapter 2, he had an amazing sermon without notes. Amazing. Such a change, man, if he wouldn't have been so broken that weekend. And some of us are so stubborn that we have to be so broken to be able to be filled. That includes my story sometimes.
So true.
So that's an example of Peter. And I encourage the audience who reads the Bible, read 1st and 2nd Peter and compare that to the Gospels and see a changed man. That's resiliency.
Yes.
Another one that hits closer to home to our topic around adolescence is David and Goliath. David was, we don't know the exact age, but he was very young, probably adolescence. And we know, most of us know the story, but he likely had fear when he went up against Goliath, when everybody else wimped out. And he didn't have weapons. He had his own weapon, which was a slingshot, if I could say it that way. But I pick on David because he was an adolescent. His mind hadn't been developed yet in terms of what we call our frontal lobe, the cortex, but he was filled with what I would call the Spirit, and he was able to defeat his enemy. And that's restoration. That's power in the name of God. And yet, keep in mind, he was rejected a lot before that, much like Jesus, by his peers. And a number of stories, it's in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So I can go on, but those are 2 simple stories, not simple, but profound, but yet simple stories of resiliency.
Thank you for taking us there. And I hope people will read that. I know I'm going to reread. And also, I appreciate the parallel of David being an adolescent and what we're talking about today. And the giants that our kids are facing are real. And also, kids are capable of facing them. Which I'm excited to get into a little bit more as well. Thanks, Mike. What does the research say about teen resiliency?
Yeah, and research means the science of what we've seen for decades. That I could cite those, and I will in a moment. But here's what we know. There's a number of things that creates teen resiliency. I'm going to focus on 3 that is research-oriented. One of them is that a little bit more of my research than what we see in the science, but I've done it long enough that I see this to be true, is that kids need to have a routine. And as I alluded to, in 2020, they were robbed of that routine, which was a pandemic within a pandemic. It wasn't anybody's fault. I'm just stating that overall. So they need a routine. And I'll get into this more in the future, but that routine should involve these 3 simple things: exercise, eating healthy, and sleeping right. Or we call it sleep hygiene. That's really important when it comes to routine. But that in itself won't do it. So the other 2 elements has to do with this, is that also that they're engaged with something that is meaningful in their life. So school, after-school activities, sports, something that gives them meaning and purpose, that is an experience, not just something they attend. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Yeah. And the third one that I feel so strongly about, please put this in bold print, that I've seen this time and time again, and I've studied quite a bit about it. The research has shown for at least 4 to 5 decades that when kids who've had trauma, we talked about trauma last episode, kids that have had trauma had a lot of adversity in their life, whether it's abuse or the pandemic over time, whatever it might be. The one key element, more than the other 2 I've mentioned, is they have one adult that they can turn to consistently. That we've seen that research after research after research. Ideally, it's great if it's a parent, but it doesn't have to be. What are other aspects and I'm going to speak of Whatcom County, but this could apply to other parts of our country. Well, there's one program I'm going to brag on a little bit because I was part of it indirectly for a while. It's called Be the One. And it started in Linden 10 years ago, and it came to Ferndale School District in Whatcom County about 4 years ago. And it's set up so that it's one-on-one, a trained life coach adult, not a therapist, to meet with a kid once a week. And it's not about dealing with trauma necessarily, just befriending them and being authentically themselves. It's a wonderful
opportunity. Program. And what is it called again, Mike?
Be the One.
Be the One.
Yeah. Okay. And it's really good stuff. It's really good stuff. And then also in the schools, in the school I worked at, we had a thing called the care team, which would be not a counselor. It would be a teacher that's trained like the Be the One that would meet with a kid once a week just to befriend and listen and support and believe in them in terms of that dynamic.
Yes.
It's sort of it's like in the New Testament, it's Paul with Timothy. He was Be the One to Timothy. Yes. He encouraged him. He challenged him. And I think Timothy wouldn't have grown like he did if he wouldn't have had Paul.
Yes.
In terms of that dynamic.
Right.
So there's study after study after study, including my research, meaning as a therapist working in the schools, that one-on-one person that they can turn to, preferably an adult, but also their peers sometimes. That is the key thing more than anything that creates resiliency in kids.
Right. I'm so glad you shared on that because it is critical. And also, too, if you're feeling at home like, oh, I feel like I want to be that to my kids, but maybe they're just not up for that with me. So it's nice to know there are other opportunities out there to seek out that support for our kids, to have mentors and leaders in our lives that can speak in to our kids' lives. I know we need it as an adult, too, in our journey. So I'm glad that you shared on that. That connection is so important. And, something that struck me when you were talking about just also having something meaningful to do after school. For some kids, they really love school. A lot of kids, they don't. And they do need something to be able to decompress and have something to look forward to, something they can put some effort into and feel proud of themselves. If your kids are coming home and they just don't know what that is, and parents are going, oh, gosh, I just want my kids to have something, and they're asking their kids, what about this? What about that? And parents are met with, I don't know. I just don't know. What would you have any advice for parents on that?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I didn't mentor my son very much when we were in the thick of that tug of war because it was too close to home. And so there was other people that stepped in that reached out to him. And it didn't mean that I failed as a parent, even though, to be honest with you, I felt that way at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Because for us parents, sometimes it's just too close to home. And so, but I will share this, that studies have shown us over the years that parents still have the most influence on their kids, even when it doesn't appear that way. I had a family session with a kid that, with his parents, that's 15, 16-year-old about 3 weeks ago. And it was so interesting because nonverbal contact in the session showed that he didn't care and he was rolling his eyes and what have you. But towards the end of the session, he shared some things that he really got what his parents said. So parents, beware that the kids will look like they don't care, especially adolescents. But in most cases, they do.
They do.
They hear what you have to say.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. And again, we've in our emotion coaching classes we've had here, and we've gone through Gottman's material.
Yes.
And he said it as well over and over that it really does matter, even if it doesn't feel like our kids are listening or care. Still showing up, still being there, still pursuing them, listening, giving them the love they need, even if it's not reciprocated, which it might not be for a very long time. And
then I'm going to speak to the one-on-one relationship, whether it's a parent or anything else. One of the key things I bring to the table with adolescents that I've learned over time as a school counselor, as a therapist, and other aspects is kids can sniff out when adults are being fake.
Yes.
Well, here's what I mean by that. When I'm being Mr. Therapist first, then Mike Black, I'm being fake. But when I'm myself with kids, then I'm being authentic, yet professionally also a counselor. And so an example, when I work with kids since I retired from my school job 2 years ago, I actually do an icebreaker with them. I have these cards called Would You Rather? And they're like really extreme questions that parents would sometimes roll their eyes to. The same boy that I just spoke about that was resistant with his parents was resistant with me. Well, I won him over mostly because of those cards of Would You Rather, Would You Rather?
That's fantastic.
I will share this in bold print that most adolescents, the way into their heart is through humor. Not all.
Yes.
If you can't if you can't laugh, this is a pretty blanket statement. If you can't laugh with an adolescent, they're not going to trust you.
Exactly. Yes.
And so you don't see the side of me very much here, but I'm a total kid and I'm proud of it.
Oh, yes.
And so, it's just being authentic. That's the key thing. And yet being professional at the same time, or whatever role you're playing at the time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. I'm so glad you brought that up because the element of fun, joy, laughter is so critical. And it can be kind of thrown to the side. Things can get so serious and stack up and we can be tired. So being able to you're saying to have a little intentionality around bringing in the element of fun.
I actually have a dad jokes book in my office in Linden where I do counseling. And it's so funny because what happens is I read that book. And just to let you know, hardly ever to high schoolers, but middle schoolers I'll read it with. And they pretend they hate it, but usually they love it.
Of course
they roll their eyes, but they also laugh.
But inside they love it. Yes. Well, as we wrap up, not to put you on the spot, Mike, but this is a pretty serious question. Do you have a dad joke today that you can share with us?
You know what's interesting? I'll think of one.
For the next episode. Well, this is really good then, because hopefully people will come back and want to hear that.
They might not want to come back after
or maybe
dad
not.
joke.
Well, thanks to everyone for listening today, and thank you, Mike. Once again, I'm looking forward to our next episode, part 2 on teen resiliency.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.